Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today and welcome to BuzzBack's latest webinar, 4 Steps to Improve Your Messaging. We'll be fielding questions at the end of the presentation today. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. You may submit questions at any time today by typing them through the private chat feature. Just look for the blue icon on your screen. As a reminder, today's call is being recorded and will be offered at the conclusion of our event. I would like to take this time to introduce you to Jonathan Weiser, VP of Healthcare Research. Jonathan has over 15 years of research experience in the healthcare arena, ranging from academic public health research to supplier-side research, working directly with the pharmaceutical, medical device, consumer health, and health plan industries. After joining BuzzBack in the spring of 2015, he jumped right in and developed BuzzBack's patient journey and communication gaps methodology. Jonathan is also an adjunct professor in the communications set at Manhattan College. Welcome, Jonathan, and please go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much, Melanie, for the introduction, and thank you all for taking your time to join today's session. So today, as Melanie mentioned, we are going to walk you through our approach to improve your messaging and really do that evaluation in a very thorough manner. Today we're going to first take you through an introduction background, then we'll go through a case study, and then we'll briefly talk about overall what this means for you and some potential next steps. So just to give you an overview about who we are, because I know that some of you probably have more and some of you probably have less experience with us directly. We are a custom market research firm. We pride ourselves on developing a lot of techniques that are very engaging, and by having them engage, we get more in-depth feedback from individuals as they go through our instruments, etc. We also really pride ourselves on visually telling a story and using the story to create the reports rather than vice versa. Right here we have just a few of our techniques, and we'll kind of walk you through some additional ones that we're going to go through today. But what we do is our two main goals are to really deeply understand your stakeholders, so whether it be patients or healthcare providers or patients, or evaluate communication materials. So whether it's concept, sales aid, or as we're going to explore today, more messaging, etc. We know that a lot goes into developing messaging and that different messages may serve different purposes. So we really wanted to develop an approach that really gives you this in-depth insight in a cost-effective and timely manner. Part of the reason that we've focused on messaging is that we know, according to eMarketer, that healthcare marketers are spending $1.5 billion on marketing communications via print, TV, or digital. And also how people are consuming this information is really changing. So for instance, 80% of physicians are now using smartphones in their offices. Patients as well are using this to seek information, let's say while they're in the waiting room. So we know that not only are people consuming a lot of information, but they're consuming it in different ways than they historically have. We also know that there are a number of different factors that go into developing messaging. So whether it's the articulation or the language, or whether it's regionally or globally acceptable, does it work with your positioning? Does it hit the emotions that you want to reach? So these are all different factors that you take into account when developing messages, and we wanted to take into account when we are evaluating them. So as I mentioned before, we're going to go through a case study. We went out to about 300 respondents or individuals in the US and the UK, and we actually focused on HPV vaccines. And part of the reason that we focused on this is because, one, HPV is the most common STI in the US, and we wanted to do something where we had different types of patients involved. So here we went out to women aged 18 to 25, so some of those who potentially are sexually active at that time, and then some women who are 30 plus who are talking about essentially their teenage daughters. So we have sort of two different perspectives here that we're exploring as we go through. We focused on vaccines because we wanted to do something that was a little bit more event specific in this case, but often when we've done this with clients, we also work on things that are more long-term or chronic conditions. We also wanted to choose a topic that was a little bit uncomfortable or could be a little bit uncomfortable to discuss. So for instance, like sex, there are things that can be difficult to talk about when talking about HPV or other STIs. And we wanted to show how our approaches and the different techniques that we use can really be helpful in getting some in-depth feedback around areas, particularly some areas that could be more sensitive to talk about if we're talking about one-on-one interviews or other such methodologies. This here just gives you an example of the specific messages that we evaluated. So when we work with clients, we will typically see messages in different buckets or different thematic groups. So what we did is we created this for a fictitious product, and we designed these ourselves. So typically there's an efficacy bucket, there's an education bucket, dosing, experience, and trust. Often if we're working with a client for a specific product, there'll be a mechanism of action bucket. But what we'll do, and as we go through, you'll see how we are able to evaluate the messages individually, but then to use this lens to see how it ties back to each of these different thematic groups. This just gives you a very, very high-level overview of our approach, and then we'll walk you through in detail. But we have sort of what we consider 4 different components. So one being rational evaluation. So ultimately, how are you going to motivate your patients or your healthcare providers? Then going to the emotional assessment. So how are you going to connect with them? What language are you going to use to kind of get through some of those deeper feelings? Then there's the optimization piece. So we know that in any evaluative study, the goal is not just to evaluate, but also to think about how can you improve your materials so that you really take them to the next level and are on point as much as you can. And then this last point is really bundling. So we know that messages do not typically exist in a vacuum, so it's not always just one message at a time, but often it's how you are putting those messages together to really amplify and broaden and diversify your message. So we'll talk about how this approach can be used for that as well. So first, let's start with the rational evaluation. What we have here is a max diff approach, which is what we use to get that sort of core motivating component. A max diff, for those of you who are not familiar, respondents, it's a form of a forced trade-off exercise where respondents would go through and they would see about 4 or 5 different sets of messages, and they would select the one that's most motivating and the one that's least motivating. And they would go through this exercise about 12 to 15 times. And from that, we are able to get the relative importance of each of the different messages that were evaluated. Part of the reason that we use this, we know that especially in healthcare, often all of these things are important. And what this does by having individuals choose what's most important and what's least important to them is it really forces people to make decisions about what is meaningful to them and what is impacting their decision. This just gives you an example of some of the output. So if you see here, you see at the top that we have a lot of the efficacy attributes really jump to the top in terms of what is most important. And this is pretty common when we work with clients as well. We tend to see that efficacy tends to sort of jump to the top, whereas some of the other supporting education, dosing, experience, etc., tends to kind of be a little bit more in the middle range. One thing that we noticed is that parents actually tended to prioritize some of the education. So some of these attributes here, they tended to prioritize them a little less than some of the young adult women themselves. And our hypothesis here could be that some of these education messages felt these younger women who were thinking more about how they can protect and support themselves feel more empowered by giving them that information, whereas a lot of the mothers may have wanted to so kind of deeply take action that they focused a little bit more on some of these more efficacy-related attributes. Just sort of interesting things. So even though we have this laid out here for total, for the entire group, it does allow us to look at this for individual groups and sort of see what is meaningful, more and less meaningful to each of them. Here we have some of the lower motivating messages. Another thing that jumped out here, which is really interesting, is that some of these experience and trust attributes, even though you see that they're fairly low here, when we compared the UK to the US, we actually saw that a lot of these were even far lower in the UK. And I think what this is, because in the UK they don't have direct-to-consumer advertising like we have here, some of these more sort of experience or trust-based metrics are probably things that they're less used to seeing and sort of less motivated by, less convinced by. So it just sort of demonstrates again how this technique can be used to sort of not only understand what your general or total market is, but then how different subgroups fit within it.